All right, man. It's been a lonely ass year, dude. When this pandemic first started, I thought I was gonna be sitting around, writing haikus, drinking tea, staring out the window. But that old quote, "All of man's problems stem from his inability to sit quietly." It's fucking true. I literally thought I was gonna be sitting around doing nothing, just peacefully reading, meditating, but that's not what happened. I started to go crazy. You know what? Let's just start at the beginning. On January 1st, the Australian wildfires continued to rage, and the Australian Navy and Air Force was deployed to help thousands of civilians evacuate their homes. The fires caused more than $100 billion in damage in Australia.
It's like fireballs in the air that explode, cars blowing up before the fire even gets near.
Fire itself is colossal. Flames have been reported to have reached.
Across parts of the country's east coast, there are scenes like this. Homes and businesses reduced to charred rubble after fast-moving fires tore toward the coastline.
In these days of environmental crisis, the American public expects our technology to provide the most effective systems for solid waste.
They've been telling us since the 70s that drilling for oil, flying planes around the world, and building more cars than people would end up a disaster, but we just kept doing it. On January 30th, the WHO declared COVID a public health emergency before we even had a name for it.
This morning, coronavirus now classified as a public health emergency, prompting
Markets
drastic
around the world, the worst sell-off on Wall Street since the financial crisis in 2008. Growing fears the virus could tip economies into recession, so we want to begin with Rebecca Jarvis at the New York Stock Exchange.
A month later, the Dow Jones had its worst week since the 2008 recession, dropping 6 points in one day for a week straight. A week after that, all of Italy was under lockdown. China was building hospitals on 2 times speed, New York City was shut down, and thousands died there.
That's not real on us, though, is it? It's not real on Earth, man. Well, if there's like a thing, it's rotating.
Quietly, the Pentagon dropped footage of aliens online, President Trump was acquitted after being impeached for abuse of power, and of course, it got worse. At the end of May, it was starting to get hot out, no one had a job or any money, but at least we could go for bike rides and walk around. Until this piece of shit police officer, Derek Chauvin, put his knee on an innocent man's neck for 9 minutes and made the entire fucking country blow up. The US saw riots in a way we haven't seen since the 60s, over 50 years ago. There were marches and protests in almost every town and city in the country, but some places were more intense than others. Entire neighborhoods were torched in Minneapolis and Portland. Where I live in Philly, there were explosions and protests every single day for weeks. There were riots in the streets, people were looting stores, destroying statues and buildings, all in the name of looking for justice in a corrupt system. I was close enough to a burning cop car to feel the heat as its gas tank exploded after someone threw a bomb into the driver's seat, but most people seemed more upset that the Apple store was closed for a few weeks. Look, there was a lot of bad shit happening in the world in 2020. I could spend half an hour listing off how many innocent people were massacred in religious or border conflicts in Africa and the Middle East, or how many American politicians engaged in blatant corruption while the people they're supposed to serve were suffering, or how many clear and obvious signs we had that our environment is changing and we need to do something about it before it's too late. 2020 was the first year when our problems weren't abstract. This isn't a war on drugs or a war on gangs or terrorism. We were in a war on corrupt policing, inefficient lawmakers and political representatives, corrupt government spending, and a changing environment that we don't even fully understand. I know I don't. And this is the first time our society's problems have been real in a long time. The war on drugs. How do you fight a war against drugs? They don't fight back. How do you fight a war on terrorism? You don't. What you do is make every American go through stupid security clearances at the airport for the rest of the time, while bombing villages in the Middle East to make everyone think you're fighting a war against terrorism. The war on gangs, the war on gangs is a war against poor people. Look, none of these wars or threats we've been worried about really involve the average American, and that's just how history's been going for a while now. But I think in some ways, this year made me realize just how many problems have been present in our society for the last few decades, and we didn't even realize it. Look at it this way. Our birth rates are plummeting. Marriage rates are low. 70% of adults under 40 are unmarried. In general, young people are having less and less sex. We're more overweight than before. We're also weaker and skinnier than before at the same time. STD infection rates are going up in women, but down in men. That means there's a smaller group of hot guys pulling all the girls while the rest of the guys are at home doing nothing. But for Gen Z, It seems like sex is also the least of our worries, and that's probably why we're having less of it. We're in the middle of a widespread mental health crisis with up to 40% of college students being diagnosed with a mental condition. And that number isn't going down with thousands, maybe even millions of college students stuck in their dorms for weeks at a time because of COVID. And as we get older, it's not getting better. We're not getting more healthy, less neurotic, or any better adjusted to life's ups and downs. And we're not getting wealthier either. Millennials make up 35% of American workers, but they only hold 4.6% of the wealth in this country. That is not a good or healthy number. People under 40 aren't even having kids because they just can't afford to raise and support a child. Gen Z is probably going to end up the same way. I read an article recently that called our current society a rat utopia. The author referenced an experiment run in the 1960s by a scientist outside of Washington, D.C. The scientist, whose name was John Calhoun, became world famous for this experiment. He housed a large number of rats and made sure they were always comfortable. They had food, a soft place to sleep, and there were also a lot of them. A much bigger group than any natural group of rats would grow to be. They also had no real need to move, no real need to work together, no struggle for survival at all. The stakes for their livelihood was literally non-existent, and this is what happened to them. They stopped having sex. Those that did have sex would abandon their maternal instincts, instead only caring for a few or even none of their babies. Males didn't breed or fight. Instead, they ate food and groomed themselves all day and slept all night. Their social behaviors diminished to the point where the colony eventually died out because the rats had no more interest in reproduction. Look, I'm not going to be an incel and compare our lives to that of an experimental rat colony from the 60s, but I think there's a similarity. We don't know anything but what others have given us, in a literal and a symbolic sense. First of all, we don't understand the natural world at all. First of all, we don't understand the natural world at all. A lot of how we see the world is done through labels, corporate, personal, political, politics especially because we have no political autonomy, so we end up jumping to severe dogma to express ourselves. Where our sense of community should be, we instead identify with large impersonal brands. We have no real way to connect with others, so choosing to like Apple or Android is our only option to feel like we're actually part of something. To quote the article I mentioned earlier, we live in a world of prosperity we didn't create and we don't understand. When the food runs out, when our soft beds and comfortable clothes are no longer a viable option, what are we going to do? Are we suddenly going to know the solution, or are we going to slowly kill ourselves off because we don't have a single solid tool to fend off the literal or metaphorical wolves at our doors? We don't understand how to deal with hardship at all. I learned two things in 2020. First of all, human history is disgusting. Look, think about all of human history. I know it sounds corny, but since the dawn of record keeping, human civilization's top 3 hobbies have been conquering our neighbors, spreading plagues, and being absolute assholes to people who don't look like us. Just because the last 50 years have been the least violent and the most prosperous in human history doesn't mean that would last forever. Why do you think everyone hates baby boomers? They hate science, they're self-centered, and they think everyone else around them is lazy because they were born into the perfect economic conditions to get rich while being completely normal people, which has never happened before in the history of human civilization, and 99% of them are fucking racist. So you remember that quote I mentioned at the start of this video by Blaise Pascal, the one about people not being able to sit still? So he has another one that I like a lot also, and it goes like this. All men seek happiness. This is without exception. Whatever different means they employ, they all tend to this end. The cause of some going to war and of others avoiding it is the same desire in both, attended with different views. The will never takes the least step but to this object. This is the motive of every action of every man, even of those who hang themselves. Clearly, this piece of advice applies not just to people, but to rats in cages too. But if I had to just give one piece of advice for 2021, it would be to rethink your definition of happiness. This year wasn't happy, and it left the future completely uncertain. So look, realistically, things aren't going to go back to normal. You have to be able to adjust and create a new normal. You have to learn how to thrive all over again. Even if the pandemic ends tomorrow, in a month, a year, or never, you can't just wait around for something to happen. You have to find comfort in the environment you find yourself in. You have to be able to achieve some level of comfort and satisfaction in the environment you find yourself in, no matter what it is. Sitting around being miserable, that's just not a good life. Like, what else is there to do except get our shit together? I don't want to end up like a rat in Rat Utopia, just dying out because I'm too busy doing my hair to realize I'm going extinct. But what I do know is that 2020 was the loneliest year. I put like 15,000 miles on my car, just driving to different state parks and staring at the sky and then going back to Philly. I drove to West Virginia because I was so bored by life. But look, when you're alone, you deserve to be good to yourself. You can't beat yourself up over something that you have no real control over. Yes, our problems are real now. Yes, it feels like everything's going to shit and nothing's ever going to be the same. And that's what I learned in 2020. Even if we're growing up, even if we don't have total control over our situation, even if it seems like things are changing for the worse, life is still beautiful, and it's always gonna be beautiful. So thank you for watching, and here's to 2021. Gotta go.
The voltage is normal. Bluetooth disconnect. Bluetooth connection is successful.
You should be surprised how they act when they know you lit. I don't wanna get one time, just a little bit. One time, just a little bit. One time, just a little bit. I don't wanna get close. I haven't been the same since I loved that hoe. I haven't been the same since I lost my bro. I say I'm gonna change when I know